The BBC was given just 18 months to put television on the air, and they came to Alexandra Palace with its spectacular views across London, partly because there was plenty of space here and it was empty, and partly because it's so high up. The television transmitter needed to be 600 feet above sea level, and we're already around 400 feet here. But it turned out that putting the television transmitter and the television studios in the same building wasn't such a good idea. John Trenouth, you're a television historian. We're standing here in Studio A at Alexandra Palace, where the television service launched in 1936, and there's one of the original EMI Emitron cameras. What's remarkable about it?
Well, this is one of the 4 cameras that were actually delivered for the opening of the television service back in 1936. When it was delivered, it didn't look exactly like this because you can see that this has got 2 lenses on the front. When it was originally delivered, it only had 1. It had no viewfinder.
So the cameraman had no idea what he was looking at?
No idea. And in fact, EMI eventually drilled a tiny hole in the side, and so the cameraman, once he'd got the camera roughly in position, had to put his eye like that to the hole, back to whatever was happening, to try and see a very faint image on the face of the tube inside. So eventually, EMI came up with this idea. They'd just put an empty box on the side with a ground glass screen at the back and a second lens, and the 2 lenses focus together, and you get a picture on the screen. When you focus on something close to, the lenses actually move closer together.
Lovely piece of 1930s engineering.
Beautiful. And for the first time we actually had a viewfinder, and it was also in colour, which we didn't get again for many years. The curious thing is that the picture on the viewfinder was upside down and back to front.
So that gave the keep the cameraman on his toes. Yes. But this wasn't all there was to this camera, was there? There was a whole lot of electronics out the back.
In fact, there's very little electronics on this. This is quite light. You could hand hold it, and they did. You had about 3 telephone kiosks of equipment for 1 camera. And bear in mind, you'd got 4 cameras, 3 in use, and 1 was called a hot spare. So you'd got 12 telephone kiosks of electronic equipment next door.
Now, there was this studio, and then there was another one next door, and that used a completely different system, completely different cameras, the Baird system.
Yes.
And that was much more complicated and not nearly as good.
And totally incompatible. So if you bought a receiver to watch the EMI programs, it normally, unless it was a very expensive one, couldn't watch the Baird programs. EMI was on 405 lines, Baird was on 240 lines.
And there was one tiny little Baird studio which just did a head and shoulders of the announcer. How did that work?
That was called a spotlight scanner, and that was technology that Baird had developed in really at the end of the 1920s, where you sat in a completely dark room, and through a window into the room, a very bright spot of light scanned your face with 240 lines of brilliant white light, and the reflection was picked up, and that's what created the television signal. Problems were at very little depth of field, which means quite simply that if you move slightly, your face balloons on the TV screen out of focus.
And there was another bigger studio which had, you could put on big shows, but the device in there was something called an intermediate film camera, which looks huge, cumbersome, and was actually really rather dangerous.
It was a curious solution to the problem. Baird had developed a machine called a telecine. Now, a telecine is a piece of equipment that takes film and converts it into TV pictures. And their telecine was very good. So what they did was they came up with the idea of having a film camera which filmed the action in the studio, and the film, instead of going into a magazine that was then taken away to be processed, the film came out through a hole in the bottom of the camera, went straight into a developing tank, and it was developed, washed, fixed, washed again, and while still wet and underwater, some 54 seconds later, it was telecined to produce a TV picture.
And one of the chemicals used in this process was cyanide, which sounds terrifying. You couldn't move this camera, and there was only 1 camera, and the film only lasted for 20 minutes.
That's right. You could pan a little bit, and you had a turret of 3 lenses, so you could go into a close-up, but the viewers at home saw you change the lens on shot.
And this presumably was never a runner, was it? It was never going to be a rival to these kind of electronic cameras.
No, it wasn't. I mean, it was desperation. In Germany, they had a similar system, but they allowed 4 or 5 minutes between filming and televising, which was much kinder to the film. Baird was desperate to get that processing time as short as possible to compete with the live Emitron cameras.
And there were problems with the sound as well.
Well, you're delaying the picture by 54 seconds, you have to delay the sound as well. And what happened was that air bubbles used to get trapped in the system, and they got trapped in the underwater sound head, and so the sound went all muffled and burbled, and the viewers at home, and they used to hit the tank with sticks, with a cricket bat. They used to kick it to try and dislodge the bubbles and make the sound come back.
Let's talk about the programmes, not the ones from the Baird studio, but the ones from this studio. There's a couple of big photographs up here on the wall. The one on the left, certainly, this studio, tall chap in the middle was the sort of leading announcer.
That was Leslie Mitchell.
Yeah. They got a lot of people in, didn't they?
Yes. In fact, the interesting thing here is that this is the opening week. Because it's a very early Emitron we can see in the picture. They've got the television orchestra behind. They've got a pantomime horse in there doing some kind of act. It was very much sort of variety, music. Later on, they did things like ballet, because, of course, you can't do ballet on the radio.
That's true.
And they were very keen to do things that you couldn't do on the radio.
Why here at Alexandra Palace?
Why here? Well, this wasn't the ideal place to build a transmitter. The ideal place would have been somewhere like Crystal Palace, but that was already taken as a space. It had to be somewhere that was ready built, because they only had 18 months to build the studios. It had to be somewhere where space was available, and it was. And most importantly, it had to be high up, because the transmitting aerials had to be 600 feet above sea level. And here at Alexandra Palace, we're nearly 400 feet up, which means the transmitting tower only had to be another 200 feet.
So cheap and quick to build.
Cheap and quick to build.
But there was a big problem, wasn't there, having the studios right next to the transmitter?
There was a terrible problem, yes. You don't want to do that. Having the studios next door to the transmitter meant that the very powerful radio transmissions coming out of the transmitting aerial used to get into the electronics of the cameras. You got patterning. Staff eating in the restaurant used to draw sparks between their knives and forks if the transmitters were on. And there were various incidents along those lines.
Over here, we have a rather more modern camera. This one's from the 1960s. And this place was still being used in the 60s. Most of BBC television had moved out by then, but news was still here right through to the end of the 60s. And the Open University was here till 1991, wasn't it?
That's quite right, yes. I mean, most of BBC's television production had moved out into larger studios, notably Lime Grove and the Television Theatre. And in 1949, the BBC signed a lease on a plot of land in White City that they were going to call Television Centre.
And they're about to move out of it. They're trying to sell it. History marches on to one last thing. Up there's a window, and there's some dummies up there pretending to be a television director. And that is the origin of the tradition in the BBC that control rooms in television studios aren't called control rooms, they're called galleries. Just tell that story.
That's right. Well, the room below it, which was the control room, was so full of these racks of equipment that we've talked about that there was nowhere for the director to sit. So they built a wooden bridge that spanned over this equipment with a vertical steel ladder that the director had to climb up. And to stop him falling off, they built a rather ornate sort of wooden balustrade. Somebody looked at it and said, it looks like a minstrel's gallery. And the name stuck.
John Trenouth, thank you very much indeed.